Hello and welcome everybody to this episode of Entheogenica, and I am sitting here today with Brian Stafford of Animas Valley Institute and many more things in the world. And we are going to have a chat about all things nature, vision questing, mythos, and a little bit about Brian's journey to where he finds himself today. And I'm really excited. I'm very inspired. One of my main inspirations is Bill Polkin, and Bill being the founder of the Animas Valley Institute, and I know a friend and teacher of Brian's. And so we crossed paths a couple of months ago as Brian was involved with bringing some work to South Africa. And that's how, our paths came to cross. So welcome, Brian. And I'm really grateful that
Yeah,
you're
thank
here
you.
with me today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to see your face, to hear your voice, to be back in this kind of space with you and kind of feeling the moment that we're in the world and what's really being asked of us here, what's being asked of us in this time. So, and I just love the name of your podcast here, Entheogenica. So,
Thank you. Thank
yeah,
you.
marveling at that.
Yeah, and I think that's a interesting space potentially for us to launch into this exploration together. And when I came to naming the podcast, to the word entheogen, this kind of idea of finding divine inspiration through the plant kingdom, but then expanding that to finding just this divine inspiration through our relationship with the natural world, and how that shape and form is available to us. And I'd love to maybe share a little bit about your background, because you were in psychiatry, right? And then
Sure.
something pulled you
Mm,
some to something
yeah, happy
other.
to share that. Yeah, let me tell this story. I think a couple things. One, I've always had a deep connection to nature. I grew up in Colorado at the foot of the Rocky Mountains and was fortunate to have a father who supported access, whether that was hiking, fishing, camping, things like that, and skiing. So I had a lot of privilege in kind of being in the wild and a lot of free time to just play in the mountains of the Rockies. And that kind of led me kind of be, you know, after I went to college, like to wonder what I was really here to do. So I didn't really know. I majored in biochemistry and had minors in English literature, and I thought I'd be a poet, but knew I probably couldn't make money doing that, and didn't really want to be a ski instructor because everybody was stoned most of the time after the day. And so I actually went on this kind of self-designed camping trip where I was in the Rockies on my own for about 7 days, actually. And I brought some books, brought some mythology, brought some poetry. Um, and I never really realized what that was all about. It just felt like the natural thing to do. I had a great time, caught a couple fish, saw amazing animals, flowers, stars. I don't remember any dreams, which is interesting, but I might have dreamt. And then fast forward, a couple years later, I made the decision to go to medical school to be a child psychiatrist and to help families that maybe didn't have some of the resources I had to find a story, especially out of challenging circumstances. So I trained in medicine, pediatrics, adult child psychiatry, worked overseas for a while to see how culture worked with psyche and if psychiatry was any benefit. And then I retrained in early childhood psychiatry and I started supporting families in need in rural Louisiana and inner city New Orleans, and then brought my kind of shtick over to Denver where I did something similar there. And I just loved it. There was something about supporting families, being a teacher, an educator, a research, building systems that I really enjoyed. And I was really good at it too. So good that in fact I got what's called an endowed chair when I was like 42. These are usually things that are granted to people when they're like 60 or close to retirement. It gives you safety, status, security, and funding to develop programs that you want to bring into the world. So everything was going great on that realm. And then a couple weeks after I found this position was coming, a voice in the middle of the night woke me up and said, "You're done." And I'd never heard a voice like that. The best thing I could say, it was the voice of God. Although I was raised Christian, I was pretty much a eco-spiritual agnostic or spiritualist, something like that, not quite exactly sure. I wasn't sure there was anything spiritual in the world, but where I felt most at home was in nature. But this voice kind of changed everything. It rocked my world. I knew if I didn't listen to it, I'd probably be miserable, actually. So I took a bit of a sabbatical and found a little program. It was like a men's rite of passage, just like a 4-day retreat in nature. It was kind of powerful, but at the end of that time, they handed out a piece of paper it said like, how to further your masculine and spiritual journey. About halfway down the page, there was this listing, Soulcraft, Crossing into the Mysteries of Nature and Psyche by Bill Plotkin. I was like, oh, I've always wondered if there was a soul. Like having left Christianity and gone into medicine where it's basically soulless until recently because of psychedelics, I always wondered what that was about. Is there such thing as a soul? And if so, what is it? So I read that book, and by page 10, I was like, oh, if the way that he writes about the world is the way the world is, I want to live in that world. And a week later, I had some time on my sabbatical. I went on one of their programs for like 7 days, a camping program into the canyons of southeastern Utah. And I had some pretty profound experiences on the land, in council, speaking. But the most profound thing that happened there were two things, and maybe I'll stop after that. Two things. One was I had a dream, and in the dream, I'm in a classroom. A classroom is always where I felt most at home in my life. Like I always had the answers. I was a great student. I read ahead. In this dream, it was like a spelling bee that we have in the United States, where the teacher was calling on each person in the classroom. And I always had an answer that was right. And others in the classroom in this dream began dropping out. They didn't have the answer. And then the teacher at the front of the class said, "Now, Brian, for the most important question of your life, we get syzygy." And I was like, what? She spoke in a language I didn't understand. And I began to panic in the dream. I began to panic. I'm like, can you say that again? She repeated. I had no idea what she was talking about. I asked her to, if there's other pronunciations, etc. And then I woke up in a panic. And when I woke up, I knew I did not know the language of soul. Actually, it just was a deep intuition, and that's why I was really here. That's the threshold I was on. That was quite unnerving. A couple of days further into that camping program, I had an experience where we were on a 24-hour solo in nature. And part of the thing that I was doing then was kind of healing my relationship with my ancestors, who were evangelical Christians, very conservative, physically punitive, always wanted you to conform and to be good. And most of my neither of my grandparents had much interest in me. My paternal grandfather had very little interest in his grandchildren. My maternal grandfather had like 35 grandchildren, so I was kind of a number. And so I was kind of bemoaning the fact I never had one person who just treasured me for who I was. And that night on this solo, that day I actually sat in this juniper tree asking it to be my grandfather and to hold me and to love me. And it was quite healing. And then that evening around midnight, I woke up and right nearby in this kind of riverbed, a dry riverbed in this desert canyon um, setting, there was an indigenous woman. And I knew the indigenous lived there 800 years prior, but they hadn't lived there since. So I was a bit altered. And I just kind of stared at her, wondered why she'd come. And then she said to me, "Welcome home." And I burst into tears. I knew this was Grandmother Earth welcoming me home after my long wanders away from nature into culture, into medicine. I had been returned to Earth. And after that moment, I began to feel very emotional about what was happening on the planet, much more tuned in to all the stories of what was happening to the different species and plastics in the oceans and global warming, all of these things. And I would say at that moment, my life began to have a different trajectory. So I just wanted to stop kind of with that part right there. It was pretty altering right there. That going back into nature with a longing to discover why I was really here and to see actually if nature was animated and enchanted and souled in a certain way, I was met in a way I'd never been met before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. It's so beautiful. And I think it's that once you've found your way back in to those, to that space or to those rites, to that passage, how utterly it alters everything about how we perceive self and how we
Mm,
perceive the world around us, and just the depth and the richness of the medicine that comes from re-entering the wild. I'm wondering if you could, maybe for those who are unfamiliar with even, Vision Quest or nature vigiling, if you could maybe just give a little bit
sure.
of a sort of synopsis of what we're speaking to here.
Yeah, happy to. Um, Maybe I'll back up a little further, a larger bird's eye view. Like historically, um, especially in nature-based peoples and current indigenous peoples that are still somewhat intact, they often have some sort of passage by which the adolescent becomes an adult. And it's not an age thing. It's not a graduation. It's not military service or anything like that. It's a psycho-spiritual wander into the mysteries of nature and psyche. And it's normative that these things happen. And it's essential so that the individual who moves into the village um, is an adult and, in a sense, a psycho-spiritual adult. And they're bringing something from the wild or something from the wild earth back to the village to help it kind of regenerate. Sometimes, if we don't do these things, culture just goes on growing and growing and growing and getting more pathological. So it's normative to have these kinds of experience, whether it's a walkabout or a pilgrimage or an amblacheia, vision fast, something like that. Almost all cultures have these traditional kind of things, and some of them use plants, obviously in Central and South America. Often nature was just enough. Others included dancing, chanting, all kinds of breath work, different things like that. So it's normative, actually, for our cultures to be healthy to have these kinds of practices. They're just embedded into the culture. They're part of the rites. They help mature individuals in the culture, something like that, and also keep them connected to nature and to mystery. It's something I think I'd always longed for, but had never found in the church. Church was kind of about spirituality, but it really wasn't. It was more about conformity in a certain way and kind of being good according to particular laws and creeds, something like that. I'd never found much of a spiritual experience except when I was in nature. So and it certainly is not there in psychiatry. Psychiatry at that time was very much a biological flatland about the ego and the brain. And so when I read this book and then heard about Bill Plotkin and the Animas Valley Institute, I was like skeptical and hopeful, we might say. And the way that we at the Animas Valley Institute call it, we call it Soulcraft practices. Mircea Eliade called these techniques of ecstasy. They're cultural rituals and practices that shift consciousness and help you connect more with yourself, with the earth, with spirit, and with your own unique soul image, something like that, something like a depth psychology, or the deepest God within, the underworld entheogenica, something like that, the deep soul image that kind of permeates it. So when I read about this, I was curious and I was like, okay, let's give it a try. And then I was met. And obviously, whenever you have a shift of consciousness that's so profound, like that dream and this other experience, it propels you forward. If you do not integrate and say yes to these things and let them undo you and make you whole, you'll become even more miserable. We see that a lot in the psychedelic space where people do not integrate what's coming, then they need another hit or another journey without ever integrating these things. Because these experiences, however they come in the different practices, they're meant for you to kind of embody into the world, and that brings you to the next part of your unfoldment, something like that. So that's a bit of what we do at the Animas Valley Institute. We run these nature-based, soul-oriented retreat center and also backpacking and wilderness programs that offer a variety of practices to kind of decenter the human, decenter the ego by opening particular ways of knowing, especially in the body and in the emotional body and the imaginal, and then allowing us to kind of experience the earth in a different way. It changes our perception and the way we participate in the world. So that's a bit of kind of what we're up to at the Animas Valley Institute. And it's kind of like what psychedelics do, but you don't need psychedelics to do it. All these cultures and at Animas, we've cultivated all these other practices to really shift consciousness.
Mm. Yeah, I love this. I reflected to my I sat when I'm doing my fasts and my vigils here in Ireland. I'm working with a teacher in the west of the country, and it involves dieting an indigenous Irish tree. So it could be the oak tree, or it might be the holly tree, it could be the ash, depending on what I'm called to, I suppose, or whoever is called. And I was sitting with the hazel tree last year, July, and I remember this moment where I had this such a strong, visceral realization. And I'd done many vigils and many plant fasts, but this knowing that that extended time alone, fasted with the tree, for me it went so much deeper than any psychedelic journey I have personally experienced. And I've had some profound experiences with entheogenic psychedelic medicines, but there was something in there's nowhere to go but to be, right? There's nothing to follow or to chase, or there's no really big moments, but yet there is the biggest aha moments that you could possibly have. And I had this really deep understanding of the potential for integrating through the vision fast or through these nature immersions, and integrating potentially bigger psychedelic experiences. And I think it's something we're not maybe educated on a lot, around how just sitting in vigil as an ally to a plant medicine journey that you may have had, and creating that space to go to be in nature, to really have that opportunity to come down and come into your body and into the contact. And have you seen that in your work?
In terms of integration of psychedelic experience, is that what you're asking in particular? Yeah, I think it's essential. And maybe our conversation might head this way because I'm also in that space of kind of teaching and guiding and training and kind of coming up with new training models, because um, the greatest need right now in the psychedelic treatment model, which is kind of this renaissance that's really hitting traditional mental health, is what happens beyond treatment. What happens beyond treatment, right? There's lots of models for treating now treatment-resistant depression or end-of-life existential angst or trauma, PTSD with MDMA, and all these iboga for all these other things. And there's a couple of ways we could go here. Part of what many of the researchers find is that it's this peak mystical experience is actually what's healing.
Yeah.
That's what they find was what healing in all the data analysis here. And that is hopeful. And the way I understand that, it's because, one, it's part of who we are. It's part of our wholeness. When we haven't had this deep connection to spirit or earth or our own soul, there's a hunger for it, and we don't know how to fill it. And what's available is buying stuff or drinking alcohol or other kinds of culturally sanctioned practices here. But what we really long for is to be whole. I call it our sacred wholeness. Connection to our own egoic wholeness, connection to earth, to spirit, to mystery, to the underworld, something like that. And I think there's a turn happening here. There is some research going on. It's not really done in nature, but it's integration work using the metaphor of the self as a tree, actually. So that's a step toward it. But let's remember, for time immemorial, before we had buildings, hospitals, clinics, all of these practices were done in nature because we were nature-based peoples, whether they are the heath in Ireland or Scotland or in the jungles of South America. We were always kind of, our primary place of belonging was Earth, and everything there actually speaks to us if we're open to it. And sometimes these medicines allow us to experience that kind of animate cosmos, that everything is divine, filled with love, speaking, has intent, purpose, and is open to conversation, something like that. So that's not really in the traditional medical model of the psychedelic space, but it's certainly what's possible. And it's, our life is not just about healing our wounds. That's kind of the problem with modern psychiatry, is they kind of hold that framework as that we're here to heal disorders or to heal trauma, when in fact that's a part of it, but the other part is deeply connecting to earth, deeply connecting to our bodies, our emotional, and deeply connecting to the natural world, as well as everything in the cosmos from this particular way that we can. We can find these places through these other techniques, through meditation, through depth psychology. Psychedelics are almost like a quicker trip to those realms. Um, and they're a bit of a taste of it, but it's more like, how do we move from a taste of it or a state of it to a stage of fully participating in what's come to me and embodying it, something like that.
Yeah. Wow. I love this sense of the potential expanding. It's almost like we, as we take these experiences and we re-enter nature more consciously for periods of time, we're almost giving that seed space to sort of permeate our beings in a new way and let the realizations land. And there is something here around, and there's a lot here, but one of the things that's arising for me is, at this time when we are in a massive state of ecological issues, war, it's a very intense time for us, for the world. And one of the things that really moved me when I first read Soulcraft, Bill speaks about these kind of adolescent adults, which you've touched on already. It's this adolescent adults, how
Yeah.
these uninitiated people haven't had this opportunity to actually step into their role in the community or to step out of adolescence, and they're just going around making all of these decisions. And for you, from your experience and seeing the people that are coming to learn and study at the Animas Valley Institute, you know, how my question is, how real is it that by allowing more of us to partake in these practices, that we can actually start to potentially change the tides a bit?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. And it's something I was skeptical of, but have become something I experienced personally, and now I guide it and I witness it in others. So I'll kind of comment on that. And part of it is our definition here, which might be helpful. A definition of a true adult, right? In most ways that we think about humans in Western culture, there's children, adolescents, adults, and the elderly, something like that. And we have a different model of that. And we also have a different definition of adult. An adult is not someone who's 18 or 21 or capable of paying taxes or military service. An adult has three particular qualities that qualifies them as a psychospiritual adult. And here they are. The first one is that they primarily experience themselves as a member of the earth community. Well, I'd never heard that definition before, right? That's the difference between an ego and an anthropocentric culture and an ecocentric culture, right? 99% of people, maybe that's a bit extreme, 90% of adults I know do not experience themselves as a primary member of the earth community. They identify by their jobs or their religion or their country or their favorite football team, something like that that's egoic and anthropocentric, rather than I belong to Gaia, I belong to this watershed, I belong to life, something like that. So that's just the first quality. That actually makes you a healthy adolescent. Anybody who does not experience themselves as a primary member of the earth community is actually a egocentric adolescent, and they have more work to do, more play, more discovery. The second part of the definition here, if the first part is primarily experiences themselves as a member of the earth community, the second one is they've had a mystical encounter of their deepest identity. We call this soul encounter, a discovery of the image, the pattern, the name, the mythopoetic identity that we're meant to live into the world. It's kind of our underworld Entheogenica identity. It's this archetype that's been waiting for us to discover, that's been kind of guiding us a little bit behind the scenes, but now we experience in its fullness, and it's life altering. And in some ways, it's might be what the death of the ego is about. We're no longer about myself, it's about this image and the greater world of life. That's the second part of the definition. The third part is that not only do they experience themselves as primary member of the earth community, have had a mystical encounter of their deepest identity, but they're beginning to live that back into culture, because it's not an immediate thing after a soul encounter. It might take many months or in fact years to kind of know enough about what this image, this soul image, this mythopoetic identity, this niche that you're being asked to step into wants from you, and how you are of service. Who are your people? What are your powers? What are your gifts? Something like that. And so let's just name, I'll just use myself as an example. Like, I wanted to help people and I wanted to go skiing and hiking, right? That's kind of where I was at like 42. And I wanted to have a family, all these things. A lot of it was egocentric about career and about the human. A little bit more nature was more for my pleasure, enjoyment, although I knew it made me feel better. After that moment in that desert canyon with Grandmother Earth, it shifted. It really pushed me deeply into ecocentrism, actually, and it propelled me further for releasing my attachment to identity. 6 months later, after that program, I did a vision fast, actually, with Bill Plotkin and his partner, Janine Marie Haugen. And in that experience, I longed to know my deepest identity. I longed to know what that was. The soul. I wanted a soul encounter. I was upset that I didn't get a soul encounter on the first program. That was my hope. But I knew it came from further allowing myself to grieve that I didn't know the language of soul, to open up further to my longing, to work further with my dreams. And on that vision fast, I kind of risked everything. One of the ceremonies we have is a fire ceremony, where you put in something into the fire that you might be holding on to that might interfere with your deepest experience. What I put into the fire was my curriculum vitae in the shape of a chair, my endowed chair, and said, my power, privilege, my place of belonging in the academic world, I could really want to hold on to this. But because I know I need to want to hold on to it, I need to offer it to the fire. May mystery take it if it doesn't serve. Something like that. And I had a very powerful solo, and I had a vision, I had a soul encounter that rocked my world further, even more than that eco-awakening experience of Grandmother Earth welcome me home. Even more than that. It just really made me feel alive, terrified of what it might mean, not knowing what it meant because it's mystical. Again, often these experiences you're not quite sure, but it's numinous. There's the mysterium tremendum. There's awe and fear and hope and longing that you'll be of service to whatever this is, and you really don't know what it is. And then over time, through mentoring and further conversation with mystery and psyche with these practices and sometimes psychedelics, I began to realize that I wasn't really here to fit in as an academic psychiatrist. I wasn't really here to help people fit into a dysfunctional culture. I was here to actually guide people deeply into their deepest belonging, that they might find the seeds of cultural regeneration from their own deepest identity, which is not fitting into culture. And it's not about disrupting current culture, immediately hoping for a change, like a lot of people in like Silicon Valley hope for. It's a deeper time perspective, that what I'm here to do is offer seeds that come uniquely from me. It's my unique offering in this lifetime. It's why, from the soul's perspective, I was born, but it might end up allowing others to find their way into the space and to change the culture over hundreds of years. It's not a quick fix. So I've experienced it personally. Bill's models and maps, I'm surprised at how accurate they are and not, because he's an incredible mapper of the human psyche and of human development. And I found them incredibly useful in my role as a wilderness guide, psychospiritual wilderness guide, and a psychedelic guide. Yeah.
Yeah. There's something emerging for me around, because it's been alive in me
Hmm.
earlier in the day, and it's coming up as a question here, and I think this is as good a place as any to ask it. And
Sure.
it's around this edge between, the word that's coming to me is grandiosity, right? This like edge that we're seeing a lot in the sort of new age spiritual community, that you could potentially say maybe is ungrounded, or potentially is a pursuit of that sort of soul encounter from that adolescent place, and something else is emerging there. But is it something that you witness or have some thoughts on around how my teacher has used a phrase with me which I love, which I'll share, and she said to me once, Kathy, you have to have one foot in the imaginal and one foot in the mundane, and it's so important that you learn to
Mm.
balance. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Your recording or your transmission paused for a little bit. I heard a little bit of grandiosity, but then I missed the next 6 seconds after that. Could you repeat that for
Yeah,
me?
I'm curious about your thoughts on, with the modern or kind of new age spiritual developmental paths. I've seen people kind of fall into this grandiosity of ego, where the spiritual ego becomes even more inflamed, so to speak. And I'm just kind of curious how that, maybe you have some thoughts on how that has emerged in your world, or how do we navigate that, I guess, in this move from adolescent into this adult, into this meeting of the soul, with this dance between
Yep.
ego inflation.
Yep. There it is. Yeah. You paused again, but I know where you're going. So yeah, I would say it's kind of like this. And part of the work we do at Animas is very different than much of the work that happens in the psychedelic world, actually. One way we might think about it is that in nature-based, healthy indigenous communities, everyone's fairly psychologically healthy. They do have wounds, they do have things. This is maybe kind of a Arcadian view of it, but this is the sense I think the way it was, especially before Western Christianity and medicine and, kind of empire came to invade these places. They were much healthier psychologically and psychospiritually than most people in Western culture are now, where because we're disconnected from nature, because we're trying to live only by cognition rather than in our bodies or intuitions or imagination, we have a lot of pathology in a certain way. And sometimes we feel really wounded. And sometimes when we find something magnificent, we can get ego inflated. We see it all the time. Well, like we've seen it in Buddhism, for sure. I'm an ascendant master. Like, really? I know you. I know what you're like day to day, my friend, right? Or when we have a soul encounter, it also could be that we become slightly inflated or maybe even more inflated. This is why it's important to have community and guides and also a sense of wholeness of people who can gently remind us that we're human and that we're not magnificent. We are magnificent, but no more magnificent than anyone else or any other creature, right? So sometimes we get in this comparison game, and I see this a lot in the psychedelic communities, in intentional communities as well, where the founder or the one who's visionary tends to lose their root. Bill uses this great phrase in his book, Wild Mind, that it's kind of like the best thing to do is kind of discover who you are and humbly apprentice to that one, but being bold. Being bold. That's the other thing. The world is filled with grandiose and brash people. That does not serve the change of culture. It needs people who are humble and bold rather than humble and meek, right? So in a healthy ego, this is why we in Animas Valley work and what I do with some of my other psychedelic guiding, we help create a healthy ego first before really going into the mysteries. And sometimes it's really helpful. You have to have access to these things for some of our nature-based programs, or other parts of yourself will sabotage what we're up to. In the psychedelic space, the psychedelics often bring us into this wholeness, but then we return to our fragmented ego afterward with a bit of a gift of what that's like, but we haven't done the long-term work of kind of maturing our ego. And that's part of the work. So part of the work is, and maybe this is an important thing about thinking about the way that psychedelic therapy is imagined differently in Europe historically than in America. In America, it's all about the mystical experience. In Europe, from the 50s to the 80s, until they were banned as well, it was also this called the psycholytic work, where you take a lower dose of psychedelic, which would not give you a mystical experience, but it loosened your boundaries and your defenses so that you could actually do the work of healing and maturing the ego. And the work at Animas does a combination of both. On most of our 5-day programs, especially our Wild Mind and our Soulcraft, we're kind of maturing the ego in a particular way and holding it is the phrase we use. And we're self-healing our addictions, our wounded parts, our loyal soldiers, our inner critics, and discovering parts of our shadow. And often on our vision fast, that's when we're going for the psychedelic experience, this mystical encounter in the underworld. So it's really a combination of these mystical experiences and the everyday holding of the ego and healing of us and tracking when we're getting inflated or when we're feeling defeated, because neither serve actually. And forgiving ourselves when we find ourselves in either of those places and returning to our center. Yeah, something like that. So I totally agree with you and your teacher as well. Yeah, we can get caught up in the vision. Yeah.
Mhm. I know there's a little bit of a delay between us, but it's good. I love this so much. This is just, yeah, my whole body is like, yes. You just speak so well to this and to this part. And the mythos, like the myth, for me personally, it's the exploration of the wild and it's the exploration of mythos and it's the potential of what we can remember about our capacities in there. And that's that part between the humility but also like taking action, right? It's about discovering that we are so much more than we have maybe memory of right now. And for me, it's a lot about recalling memory. It's like recalling the memory of our ancestral wisdoms, our spiritual wisdoms, these parts that were
Yeah,
so deeply entrained with the world
absolutely.
for all of history. And with mythos, with myth, and for me, myth is very much shaped by the shape of the land, the people of the land, and also my own kind of blood lineage. I'm curious just to hear you speak a little bit about that, about how are you interfacing myth as a tool for healing or a tool for self-remembrance?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. I think part of this comes from the relationship between myth and archetype. Might be a way to kind of find our way in here. Archetypes, the way Carl Jung defined it, is they're kind of like the primordial images, powers, senses. They have a particular um, desire and power and something they do to our psyche. We might put it that way too, or something they offer to our psyche. Like when we're in the archetype of the father, we're behaving a particular way. It's a kind of archetype. It's a kind of mythos here, right? And if you look at mythology, there's healthy fathers and not so healthy fathers here. And when it comes to kind of archetypes and mythos, we also know that these archetypes are ever present and showing up in dreams. Like they show up in dreams, archetypal presences in dreams. Like I'm thinking of our friend here, William Butler Yeats, right? Can I bring us into that poem again? Yeah, we spoke of it before, but I don't think we actually talked about it. But there's this really interesting poem by the Irish English um, poet, essayist, visionary, spiritual writer, William Butler Yeats, and he has this poem called The Song of Wandering Angus. And let's remember that Wandering Angus is the Celtic god of myth, beauty, and poetry, right? It's in the mythology of the land, actually. It's land-based mythology, this Wandering Angus. And when Yeats was about 24, he had this dream that he turned into a poem. Actually, he wrote the poem called The Song of the Wandering Angus. It goes like this, and it brings in what you shared at the beginning about your recent fast, because there's something magical about the hazel tree and the hazelnut. I went out to the hazel wood because a fire was in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel wand and hooked a berry to the thread. And when white moths were on the wing, and I always screw this part up, and when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream and I caught a little silver trout. Like this first stanza is setting the frame that he's dreaming, but he's holding an archetypal Irish fishing rod. He's going fishing in his psyche here for inspiration, fire in his head. Here's the second stanza. And when I had laid it, the fish, on the floor, I went to blow the fire aflame, and something rustled on the floor, and someone called me by my name. It, the fish, had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by my name and ran and faded through the brightening air. Well, that's a pretty interesting transformation of what he caught to this glimmering girl who names him. We'll come back to that. Names him, and then she leaves. It's kind of a transient experiences. The third stanza is set way in the future. Maybe it was part of the dream. Maybe he made a commitment in this third stanza to this name, to this image, this woman fish. Though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone and kiss her lips and take her hands and walk among long dappled grass and pluck till time and times are done the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. Right, so here, this is what Yeats is known for, his incredible imagination amongst poets, but it's even deeper than that. In this dream, he finds his deepest mythos, we might say, through a dream where he goes fishing in his psyche, catches a trout, which is also kind of a magical fish because there's the salmon of wisdom or knowledge in Celtic mythology. But this one actually turns into an anima figure, we might say, a beloved, an anima figure, as Jung called it, something that's guiding us to our destiny here. And she here, besides changing, names him. He doesn't name it directly in the poem, but we can infer that she named him, "You are the wandering Angus." And then she went away, right? And then the rest of the poem is, I sense it's kind of like, I'm making a vow to follow her, to court my beloved, to court my anima, my muse, and I'm going to be the wandering Angus. And the way he understood who he was in the world, from a mythopoetic sense, a mythos, was not as a playwright, not as a um, essayist, not as a writer of spirituality, and not as a defender of Irish rights, but as someone who plucked apples. That's the metaphor for what he was doing. So every time when you hear that, he plucks the silver apples of the moon and the golden apples of the sun. There's something that he's doing in that metaphor, that he's getting wisdom from the moon, from the sun, from the fish, inspiration. And that's actually what's informing his poetry, his essays, the way he is in the world. So it's a great metaphor and a mythopoetic image that he is. William Butler Yeats was Wandering Angus, plucker of apples. You know, you don't put that on a business card or on a website, but that's what he was doing. He is so vast, but it's not from his work, it's from his identity that he made this commitment to her, to plucking apples, and to offering whatever his muse wanted to come through into the world in his lifetime. He did it, and that's why he's still remembered, actually, because it's guiding us toward that we have this same thing as well. We have this image, we have an inner anima or animus that wants to guide us, name us, help us remember who we are, and help us understand why we were born from the soul's perspective, what we're here to do. So that's a bit of a wrap on mythos and archetype. This is maybe Yeats's primary archetype or his soul archetype, although his anima is also an archetype. The fish is an archetype. The fire is an archetype. Yeah. The elder in the later part of the story is the archetype. Yeah. And it's a mystery. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually saw, I'll email it to you later. I was in Edinburgh on my way back from Turkey for the weekend, and I saw the most beautiful painting of Angus Og in the
Mm,
Gallery of Art in Edinburgh. So I'll send it to you later. And I love,
beautiful.
interestingly, the juniper tree and Angus Og were very present with me this past weekend. And here they were emerging in this conversation between us, which for me is part of the magic of how these archetypical forms are sort of subtly communicating when your sensitivity just drops down a little bit more. And then there's these moments like we're having here where it's like, oh, yes, there is a communication afoot.
Yeah. Yeah. It's quite beautiful. And it's interesting, these kind of synchronicities, or how these things kind of just kind of resonate. I'm Irish, by the way, and half Norwegian. So often much of my imagery and my dreams and archetypes have to do with kind of Norse mythology or Celtic mythology. It's woven in our DNA. Like a lot of the dreams I've had, I didn't even know about these characters and the mythology, and then they show up. I'm like, oh, that's the way the world's woven. It's so much more mysterious than just biology and ego, right? There's this imaginal world that's just kind of waiting, should we step across, filled with longing and grief that we don't know what that is, and hope. Yeah.
I love this. Um, My closing question to you is, if people are wanting to learn, so do you guys train practitioners over at Animas Valley, or is it more for people that are going through self-development, or is it a bit of both? Well, self-development, self-remembrance might be a better phrase.
Sure. Yeah, we do both. We have the primary thing that Animas Valley is here to do is to train guides to what we call the soul initiation, to the dismemberment of the ego and the remembrance of the soul image, and to the embodiment of that in the world. And the way we do that is we run programs by which others, including our trainees and other people interested in this journey, can participate and go on this entire journey of soul initiation. And we have two particular training programs. We have one training program, which was the original training program, called the Soulcraft Apprenticeship and Initiation Program. And that's for people who have had a soul encounter and have worked with it enough to know that they're also called to guide this journey. And it's a lengthy training program, minimum maybe 6 years, something like that. It's not full time at all, because it's interspersed with doing some programs, doing some trainings, doing some personal projects, personal mentoring, all those kind of things. And then we also have this other training program, which is more like what we would call holing and self-healing. It's a nature-based preparatory work. One way to think about it is it's transpersonal, nature-based internal family systems model, working with our parts and our archetypes. But it's very different from IFS too. Um, it's because we explore anima, soul, shadow, and we are also into cultivating the self, whereas internal family systems assumes you have a whole self, which we don't believe is true. We need to cultivate it. So that training program currently has 140 trainees in it from around the world, um, and quite a few in Europe. I think we've trained maybe 12 people that are pretty close to finishing our level 2, and we just have a whole new crew of 20 Czech eco-psychologists who are joining that training program. But we have a lot of people in every continent now except for Asia and Antarctica in that training program. And people should, if they're interested in this work, the main thing they should do is join us for a program. We do have introductory programs online for like a weekend or 3-hour sessions 3 times just to kind of get a foot in the water, so to speak. We also have other lengthy programs online. I'm guiding one that starts today called Fishing for Shadow, actually, where I use that hazel wand image and we go looking for shadow. But we have many other programs. Next year in 2025, we'll probably guide 40 programs and trainings in the United States, 45 internationally around the world, and then 20 online. And I'd recommend if people are interested to maybe try a program, an intro program, read one of Bill's books. I typically recommend Soulcraft or his Journey of Soul Initiation. And then if you're interested in one of the training programs, read Wild Mind or Nature and the Human Soul. And join us for a program. Animas has pretty significant scholarships to support people because we know the dollar's strong, and a lot of other people who've kind of pulled out of culture don't have the resources they need to fully participate. So we have all of that. And you can find us on our website at www.animas.org. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope I get to join you guys on something at some point in the future. It would be really beautiful to integrate some of the language and the lens I think that you're all carrying over there, and I'm really grateful to you and to Bill and to everybody and all the beautiful people that are hearing a call back to this work and this really necessary medicine. So thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be with me
Well,
today.
yeah, thank you for saying yes to this soul path as well, and for being a promoter of this work in the world and an exemplar that it lives everywhere, but kind of in hidden places, right? It's not just Animas. You are doing this work. Your teacher's been doing this work. There are other mystery schools around the world that are doing something akin to this. There's something happening right now as the dominant culture begins to crumble. The real juice of life and those guiding us to the real meat and purpose of life are waiting to kind of find our place and to guide others into it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Have a
Yeah,
beautiful day.
you as well.
Thank you.